Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the roundtable organized by the Lisbon Bar Association and ProPública on the theme of Democracy and the Rule of Law, Portugal's Role in a Global Conversation. My name is Shrikesh Laxmidas. I am Chief Editor at the Agência Lusa News Agency, and I will have the pleasure of moderating the panel in a few minutes with our distinguished guests. But first, we have some opening remarks by Rebecca Neff, Chargée d'Affaires at the United States Embassy in Lisbon. Rebecca, please.
Good evening, everyone. Boa tarde. It's great to be here, and I want to thank very much João Massano for this invitation, and the Lisbon Bar Association for hosting this event, and also ProPública for their partnership. They've been instrumental in pulling this event together. I'd like to also express my gratitude to Samuel Chu for being here and for the incredible work that you have done advancing human rights. And we're really looking forward to hearing from you this evening. Thank you for coming to Lisbon. Samuel has a very busy schedule, so I'm glad that we're part of that. And it's really an honor to be here today for this important conversation. I think something that we all know is that human rights are universal. They don't belong to one religion, one country, one ideology. And really they apply to everyone, all the time, everywhere. And human rights are really essential to our vision for democracy and to a free, open, and prosperous society. We all face challenges, and it's important to recognize as democracies that we sometimes have shortcomings. But if we look around the world, it is concerning that we see backsliding in human rights and democracy. And in the People's Republic of China, for instance, we see a government that continues human rights abuses, including genocide, internment, sexual abuse, things that are very difficult to talk about. And I'm sure we'll address some of those here this evening, including crimes against humanity, crimes against Uyghurs, repression of Tibetans, and targeting of individuals for just exercising their very freedom. Last year marked the 25th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong, and it's evident now that Hong Kong and Beijing authorities no longer view democratic participation, independent media, fundamental freedoms as part of the promised autonomy under the system of one country, two regimes, two systems. So I think we'll hear in 2019 millions of Hong Kongers like Samuel Chu participated in protests to oppose the controversial extradition legislation, which would allow Hong Kong residents to be extradited to other countries, including back to the PRC. And Beijing's response was the national security law, and that really set the stage for the erosion of autonomy and the dismantling of rights and freedoms. And yet, one of the things that we saw, which was so inspiring, was activists in Hong Kong, so many individuals around the world who worked tirelessly to safeguard and uphold human rights and dignity. And it really, we were talking about this right before we started, it takes tremendous courage to seek justice when the powerful stand against you. And I think that is one of the really important things in the messages tonight for the lawyers who are here. Lawyers can really play an important role in promoting human rights and democracy and rule of law. It's really the laws that protect the innocent, and they also give us the tools to prosecute those who have committed these terrible atrocities. The laws can ensure that these legal systems protect the dignity and equality of people, no matter their beliefs or their backgrounds. And those systems protect every citizen. So the law, it can shine a light on human rights abuses, and it also can build coalitions to bring about change, and that's really important. So that's why we're here tonight. That's why we're here to have this conversation. And without further ado, I invite the panel to come up here. Thank you very much.
So we'll now proceed. So we'll now proceed to the round table. On this panel, we have the pleasure of hosting our special guest, human rights and pro-democracy activist Samuel Chu. Joining us to discuss this theme are also Lídia Neves, lawyer and board member of ProPública, and João Massano, our host, president of the Lisbon Bar Association, or in Portuguese, the Conselho Regional de Lisboa da Ordem dos Advogados. I'd ask the three guests to join the table.
Thank you.
Comfortable?
Yeah.
Super comfortable.
Good.
Thank you.
Lots to talk about. We have an hour slot according to our agenda. I think it might be short, but we want to leave some time at the end for some questions for the audience who is in the room at the moment. Welcome to Portugal, Samuel, and thank you all for attending this discussion, taking part in this discussion. Samuel, I'd like to start with you to ask you briefly, I know it's a tough ask, to outline the role you and the organizations you've been involved in have played in the fight for the rule of law, rights and democracy, particularly in Hong Kong over the last few years, taking us to how you see the situation today.
So thank you so much for having me, and I'm very privileged and honored to be part of this discussion and panel, and thank you for the U.S. Embassy and to Rebecca for your kind words. Let me start with maybe a brief story. In 2018, I was in Hong Kong attending the trial of 9 pro-democracy activists. It was one of the first few cases where Hong Kong began to prosecute peaceful protesters and organizers, and that particular trial included social workers, lawmakers, and a Christian minister who happens to be my father. And they were tried and eventually convicted for organizing the protests in 2014, which came to be known as the Umbrella Movement. And one of the distinctive features of the idea of one country, two system was that Hong Kong was always seen as a society that had the rule of law, that it was protected separate from a system in the mainland. And I remember actually the day that the trial ended, I was standing outside and one of the reporters came up to me and asked me how I felt about the trial. And I said that, sadly, I don't have any doubt that my father and others were going to be convicted. There was no doubt in my mind that they were going to make an example politically out of these 9. But I said that I was very grateful that I was able to be in the courtroom while they were being tried, that my father were able to select his own legal representations, that he was out on bail and was not detained and devoid of communication with the outside while he was on trial. He was able to actually make a statement. In fact, he preached a sermon from the courtroom. And he was able to do all those things because of the protection that existed. That day was just weeks after the Hong Kong government proposed this extradition law. That would have allowed that trial that my father was on to be taking place in the mainland, under mainland law, where none of those things that we enjoy benefits, yeah, would have been. And I bring that up because I think fundamentally that's what has happened in Hong Kong. People will look at, and the pro-Beijing government and regime would say that it was only one extradition example. But what they did, and eventually with the national security law in 2020, was to poison the whole rule of law system in Hong Kong. And that they did it in such a cynical way where they said that in the national security law, which was imposed without any input from Hong Kong, in fact, we didn't read the text. No one in Hong Kong read the text until it went into effect on July 1st in 2020. That even though it's only a piece of attachment to the legal system in Hong Kong, what it does is that it fundamentally erases the protection and the divide of the two system in one country, two system. And that's where we find ourselves today. Just this week, media company executives, publishers of newspapers are on trial, 47 politicians who tried to run for election in the Legislative Council are on trial. All of those crimes, and ultimately not just in Hong Kong, a month after the enactment of the national security law, I became wanted by the Hong Kong police for exercising my constitutional rights overseas as a U.S. citizen, lobbying U.S. government. That shows us the extraterritorial nature, that this does not stop in Hong Kong or, in this case, in Macau as well, where the same national security law is being implemented. And that's what we're seeing as far as the deterioration and the dismantling of the rule of law.
That was amazingly concise and to the point. I'm glad I asked you that way. Coming now a bit into the title of the roundtable, and you mentioned Macau, and can get back to that. What is the main purpose of your visit to Portugal, and how do you see the role that Portugal can play in places where democracy and rule of law are under threat, such as Hong Kong?
So this is my first visit to Portugal. I'm really actually privileged and feel very honored to be here. Part of it because of the shared history of Macau and Hong Kong. The negotiation of the handover and the treaty were negotiated not too far apart from each other. One, Macau was based really on this idea of unconstitutional system in Hong Kong. They were both promised 50 years of unchanged autonomy and freedom. And while I think that, so that for me is a very important connection, because just as the international community, it's not just the British government that made a deal with China. The Joint Declaration of 1984 was registered in the UN. It was endorsed by the international community, either the United States and other nations. For me, it is very clear that there's legal obligations for both Britain to Hong Kong and for Portugal to Macau for the promises that were made to both territories. And I think that that in itself is not just about supporting human rights, but it's actually a legal obligation of what has now taken place in both of those territories. That is one of the reasons why I wanted to come here to Portugal. A second reason that could be sort of summarized in one very immediate question and concern is that I just described to you what has happened to the rule of law in Hong Kong. Portugal at this moment is one of 2 European countries that has an active extradition agreement with Hong Kong. Portugal and Czech Republic. Me being here, just my presence here, is, I think, a very resounding sort of challenge and a question to the Portuguese government and the population of, if this is what has happened to the rule of law in Hong Kong, why would a rule of law country like Portugal endorse a failed system by having an active extradition agreement? Because that's ultimately, I'm not afraid to be here. I came here, so, and I was in Parliament. They were, and no one, is going to stop me. And I also believe in the Portuguese legal system that I would not be extradited if requested. But that's not the point. The point is that extradition agreements are inherently an endorsement of the other country's legal system.
Trust in the other system.
Yeah. And I can parade now to you all of these examples of the political persecution and the corruption of the legal system in Hong Kong and in Macau. And that should, in itself, becomes a clear call for action that we, and that Portugal should stand up and say that we no longer recognize and endorse this system, that and the reciprocity should not be given.
Portugal has strong economic ties besides history to China. We saw 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when Portugal hit a very difficult point in its economic history, that it took in Chinese investment into some of the largest companies, largest sectors in the country. Has this situation tempered in any way Portugal's reaction in this situation? Has it tempered the issue of extradition or being more vocal on the political level of speaking out against human rights problems in China?
So I would love to, I would definitely love to hear from the rest of the panel, but I might be a little bit biased, but I think from experience, and Portugal is not unique, right? That we're not talking about, I live in the US, I work in the US. We have tremendous amount of what I consider entanglement and relationship with China. I think that what is alarming to me is that I do think that in the US, example, and in Canada and other European countries, even in Germany, slowly what we've seen is a awareness and a willingness to debate openly about economic ties, about investment, about these exchange political, even cultural, between PRC and other authoritarian regimes. I think that for me is lacking here, at least from my limited exposures, and I would love to hear the rest of your opinion about this. That, I think, is the point, is that I don't think that we're living in a fantasy world where we can just cut off and reverse investment and economic ties. But what I think needs to be done is that there needs to be this much more robust discussions of what does it mean that Chinese state-owned companies are controlling infrastructures that are key to Portuguese economy and society. What does it mean that there are, I think, unofficial police stations that are operating on Portuguese soil? What does it mean that there are direct interference at times and maybe pressure put on academia and universities and other forms that might not be as obvious? Those are the things that I think needs to be brought into the open and scrutinized, debated, and also look from a perspective of reciprocity. China is never going to let Portuguese invest in any infrastructure in China. And what is allowed on social media and free speech for Chinese diplomat here in Portugal is not actually allowed for any citizen in China. And I think that one of my hope is that is to open up this conversation to be able to have at all levels of society, not just in the parliament, not just in the legal society, but to see that this needs to become an open discussion and that we need to be willing to question and to follow the money and to ask questions.
Just taking one step back, in this situation, it's a question to João and Lídia, welcome into the conversation. How do you see this global conversation on democracy and the rule of law in general in the last few years, as Samuel was describing in relation to China? What concerns you? What is your feeling about the impression that we have here in Portugal? Are these issues becoming visible? You both you're both lawyers, you're both in the legal system, plenty aware of these things, but is this becoming an issue that is being considered in society in general? Lídia.
You want to start?
Ladies first?
Yes,
Okay,
ladies
let's do this.
It's clockwise.
Okay, let's do this. Thank you so much. On behalf of ProPública, just let me start by saying that this is a great pleasure and a great honor to participate in this event along with prestigious personalities. A special word to Samuel and congratulations for all the work that you've done. So on your question, I've drafted some notes that I'm going to share with you guys. If it takes too long, I will just shut up. If you just do like this and no.
Don't worry.
Let's see if you feel that this is so interesting as I did consider that it was when I was preparing my notes. So let's do this. The rule of law may be defined as the mechanism, process, institution, practice, or norm that supports the equality of all citizens before the law, secures a non-arbitrary form of government, and more generally, prevents the arbitrary use of power. We all agree on this, I think. Democracy could not exist without the rule of law. This is my personal belief. If the principles of law are undermined, democracy is in danger. At the same time, only a democracy can safeguard the rule of law. The constitutional principles of democracy and rule of law are therefore linked to each other. Let's talk about we all are acquainted with these subjects, but let's start by talking a bit about the United Nations. The rule of law is a principle of governance in which, this is for the case of the United Nations, the rule of law is a principle of governance in which all people, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and consistent with internal human rights norms and standards. It requires measures to ensure adherence to the principles of, and let's do our list, supremacy of the law, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, separation of powers, participation in decision-making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. We may now go to our regional part here on the European Union. The rule of law is also enshrined on the Treaty on the European Union. And this is one of the common values for all European member states. Under the rule of law, all public powers must always act within the constraints set out by the law, in accordance with the values of democracy and fundamental rights, and under the control of independent and impartial courts. Respect for the law is essential for the very functioning of the European Union. For the effective application of the European law, for the proper functioning of the internal market and for maintaining an investment-friendly environment and for mutual trust. Along with having a functional democracy and respect for human rights, including the rights of minorities, the rule of law is also one of the key criteria to fulfill by the countries wishing to join the European Union. Economic transformation of modern society has brought us challenges and opportunities which require a collective response guided by the rule of law. The rule of law is fundamental to international peace and security, political stability, economical and social progress and development, and by far the most important, in my view, to protect people's rights and fundamental freedoms. The development of inclusive justice with systems designed for all should respond to individual and collective needs, devoting special attention to those historically marginalized and at risk of being left behind. Such goal necessarily involves the prevention of serious violations of human rights by creating a full range of processes as well as judicial and non-judicial mechanisms, and empowering individuals and communities to make use of such justice to protect their fundamental human rights. This is my little notes. I will believe that it was useful for you. Yes. At least it is in accordance with my personal and with my personal beliefs and the ones from ProPública. Thanks.
Thank you, Lydia. João, same question really. Is how do you see these issues being confronted or dealt with in Portugal,
I wouldn't
or personally and as a society?
Yes, I'm not going to repeat what my colleague said, of course. I agree with what she said, but about something that Samuel said, I would say that sometimes we seem to be living in, I don't know if you know the movie from Jim Carrey, Truman's Show. Sometimes we are just like puppets. Sometimes we are driven to where they want us to go. The question is, how can we avoid this? How can we go to where we want to go and not where somebody else wants us to go? This means that when we say and when we hear there are hidden powers, like you said, and I agree with it, it means that we never know if what press says is free press or not. Even when we have fact-checking in, for instance, in the newspaper or whatever, we see that even the news that are checked, what's the criteria for that? Who chooses it? So I think that knowing what really happens, it's the main question. Because we see Ukraine's war, and we see the power of the press. Because depending on which side you are going to see a view or other view. It seems that we have two different wars, that they are not in the same place. So these days, I would say that the main issue, the main danger for the civil rights is the press. Because a good press, a lobbying that nobody knows that is maneuvering in the dark side, can make us all think that, for instance, Russia is right, Ukraine is right, and nobody really knows what happens. Even the news that we see about the war in Portugal, I think we are all aware that are Ukrainian-sided. So, even though we might consider that the reason is with Ukraine, we must be aware that it's not the whole truth that we see. So, I would say that for the lawyers and for everybody, the main fight should be to have a free press, because press is the basic ground for democracy and rule of law. That's why we try to have open debates in Lisbon Bar Association like this one, because we want freedom of speech. We want everybody to have their truth, and then people should decide which side they want to be in. So for us, and I should say it in the beginning, it's an honor to receive this event and to make it with the US Embassy and ProPública, of course. It was with great pleasure that we are hosting this event and about all the things that we want to talk about. We see that even though we have more information, I feel that we know less than before, because we cannot verify everything, and we decide which side we want to see when we go to social networks, because the algorithm gives us our truth, and we only see our side. So I would say that European Union, for instance, we are talking about making something about free press, having some control of Meta and all the big companies, but until now we have nothing concrete about it. So I would say China, US, Portugal, whatever, when we see the news in Portugal, we are always trying to decide if it's or not the truth. I think it's the basic question. The truth is out there, but nobody knows where it is.
Somewhere.
So that's a very good point, which leads me on to my next question is, the press in Hong Kong, from the British Times to the last decades, I worked in a big international news agency which had hundreds of journalists in Hong Kong, no longer has. There's been a walkout, forced walkout really, by the international press, and the local press is having a very hard time. How do you see the importance of this part of China's strategy to control rule of law in Hong Kong? We know that lawyers have been slammed, and I could use a fancier word, but slammed in the press for whatever actions they do, so rendering them almost impossible to operate, and a lot of them, dozens of them, leaving even. How is an idea of a free press lost entirely in Hong Kong now?
I think that it is not by accident that the one group that the Chinese and Hong Kong government went after most aggressively right after the national security law, besides people like me, were the media executive and companies. So I agree with you. I think about the role that rule of law had played in a negative way of how almost always the first that goes down are the publishers, the reporters. And in Hong Kong, it has been a dramatic display of my friend and colleague who's now in jail, Jimmy Lai, who is a billionaire, but also used to be the publisher of the largest opposition print newspaper in Hong Kong. His operation was shut down overnight. They essentially went to the newsroom, had 500 police officers go through the newsroom, gathered all the materials, paraded him in handcuffs and chains out of the newsroom, and froze their account so that they can no longer print. And it happened in such a shocking and short period of time that they were able to use that, leverage that, to shut down then everybody else, because Stan News and the second largest just decided that we can't take that risk. But their executive were also arrested. And it's I think it's very alarming, at least not just for Hong Kong, but because precisely that Hong Kong has such a robust news sector, such a free press sector, to watch it be dissolved and dismembered within 18 months, I think should serve as a warning to any free society who has a free press, who believes that they have some sort of freedom of press. And I think that that's a big part of it. And I think related to your other point is that one of the first things that the Hong Kong government did after they were able to shut down the news outlet is to publish and promulgate and propose new, what they call fake news legislations. Right. And I think that this shows, I think part of the vulnerability that we face as free society is that, yes, we can't really control everyone's speech, but when we're dealing with the influence of authoritarian regimes like Russia, where they can promulgate and spread false narratives publicly, and China, who's helping to amplify those messages, then it becomes really a dangerous weapon, because you have state medias that are operating in free society who are blatantly parading propaganda and talking points from regimes that have real consequences and put real pressures on free society and government. And I think that what we're seeing in Hong Kong, I think, for me, could happen anywhere. And it's not just a regime sponsor, but I think that we are now in a place where free press is under attack. You know, we just had World Freedom, Press Freedom Day, and the number of journalists who are being jailed are unthinkable in a world where we're supposed to be much more freely able to access information. And I think that that responsibility is in our responsibility to actually hold accountable and put pressure on how to protect these freedoms that are under attack constantly.
With the freedom of the press in situations like that where they've been heavily restrained, other parts of society have to come up to try and compensate and defend these rights, to also expose abuses of other rights. The question is for all three of you, really, is how does civil society, you're involved in one way or another in civil society, how does civil society, NGOs, bar associations, activism, how important is this effort, and what needs to be done more in relation to Hong Kong, be it in Portugal or outside?
I would just like to add something to what Samuel said. Two things are very important. One, courts. Respecting the court is essential. Second, press. I would like to add something to this discussion, which is how many Portuguese know that we have problems in courts in Europe, because there are judges in some European countries that belong to European Union that are controlled by the state. Nobody knows in Portugal. It's not a political problem, it's not a public problem. If you ask somebody on in the street if they know if there are problems in courts around Europe, they would say that there are no problems, because we have freedom, we have the state, we have the rule of law and things like that, but nobody talks about it because we have serious problems around Europe, because European Union started with democratic principles, and then there were some countries that entered European Union and that didn't have that culture. So, and nobody talks about it. So that's the importance of the press, not having a single-eyed press. So about the courts, Samuel quoted the situation about his father in court. He was free to do what he wanted. That's what courts are for. That's the main reason. So as long as we can keep courts independent and press independent, we are going to have freedom. If one of them is endangered, freedom is going to be a little bit stressed. So what we need to do is to enforce the power of courts and the press, to have freedom in these two sides. If we have it, I'm sure that we are going to a better world. And even in Portugal, if we see, even with several changes in our law that are occurring these days, that are going to affect us as lawyers, are being made in a way that is going to make us more dependent from the government. So I would say it's not a good sign. So we need to pursue freedom everywhere. And lawyers were always defenders of democracy, like it happened before 25th of April. So we were going to jail because we defended people that shouldn't be defended according to the previous regime. So I think these are the two standards and basics that we need to defend. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a very good point, João. Very good point. I would say that Portuguese civil society should be more interventive and concerned about critical issues. I could point to some of those issues. The proliferation of hate speech and incitement of violence, preventing radicalization and violence extremism, climate change and an environment impacting on people's security, the complexities of artificial intelligence and cybercrime. Let me talk a little bit about ProPública, which I'm very honored to represent here. ProPública is the first Portuguese NGO dedicated to public interest law, so we are very proud of this. We focus on promoting justice, community rights, and responsibilities. We are committed to the public good and the creation of more just, fair, sustainable societies with the contribution of public interest lawyering. We defend that everyone has the right to speedy, equitable, and tendentially free justice. And we provide legal aid for individuals and independent organizations committed to the defense of the rule of law, freedom, and human rights. We wish to contribute to the construction of a committed and inclusive community founded on the respect for collective rights, moral citizenship, and tolerance. We at ProPública focus on representing the most vulnerable individuals, and we do this in strategic causes of public and social interest, namely in the defense of victims and discrimination and the rights of future generations. As Samuel once said, prepare yourself, and I quote, can I? Every single person living in a community possesses unique potentials and powers, capable of making a contribution to society. Human right is a God-given gift, never to be arbitrarily taken away by any political regime. This is wonderful. Since its incorporation, ProPública works every day to make such contribution to society, hoping to make a real and effective difference on people's daily and future life. And we intend to keep on doing so. We wish to embrace a lot of opportunities, such as this one, to discuss and reflect with others, such as Daniel, who have such a significant and important role. Thank you so much, Samuel.
Thank you.
Can I just add something about what Lydia said? I think raising social awareness is crucial for our future. I would say that one of our main challenges is to make people think, because people don't think these days. People don't think. So we need to put people to think. That's our main challenges these days.
Yeah, absolutely.
You threw me off by putting words
Sorry.
back at me, but I appreciate it. I'm very flattered.
No, it's wonderful.
I'm
It's
very
wonderful.
flattered.
I couldn't help myself, sorry.
No, but something I think that in particular ProPublica and public interest law it plays a critical role here because, well, first of all, I think that I'm sometimes called an activist. I'm sometimes called whatever worse names. In the U.S. in particular, being activist as it relates to the law is like a bad word. Like you're not supposed to be an activist in law, because there's a sense of conservativeness that law is supposed to be unchanged. It's supposed to be, above this, activism. And if you're an activist judge or activist lawyer, you're like the bad one. But because I'm biased, I take a little bit of a different view. Because it's not just in Hong Kong, right, that we see this erosion of rule of law. I have a lot of friends who have been protesting on the street of Israel for the last 2 months, 3 months, because they have found themselves in this situation where this whole respect and independence of the court has been directly attacked. And so what I observe, in Israel as an example, but all around the world, is related to specifically public interest. Before I worked in Hong Kong, I worked on a lot of other human rights issues related to LGBT communities, related to immigrants in the U.S. in terms of race in the U.S. Precisely because I think that there is something to be said about when the rule of law is only a stabilizing force for the existing status quo, we are always going to be losing and falling backwards. Yeah. And so for me, it's not just about fighting for dissidents and freedom fighters and activists in Hong Kong, but that the only way that we maintain the level of respect and independence and awareness that I think I definitely agree with is to always look to the places where the legal system is excluding or hurting or not addressing inequalities, wherever that might be. And I think that, for me, if someone want to call it activism, I think it's fine. Because I think public interest law is in itself activism of trying to define law and rights that have yet to exist. And by doing that, we are renewing and maintaining the respect for the courts. And I think that I would say complacency is what I see as a danger in a lot of ways in what we consider free society, like Portugal, like the US. And I mean, I don't have to go very far to talk about US, it's in one of the most radical, I would say, act of rescinding rights in recent years, of taking away, in this case, the abortion right or reversal. For me, those are the places, and this for me is a consistent. What is against rule of law, what is undemocratic and unfree in Hong Kong is also unfree in Portugal, it's also undemocratic in the US. And so for me, this is why it matters, because I'm not, for me, I understand that Hong Kong seems like such a far place. China seems like such a far place from Lisbon. But I think that what drives me and the people of Hong Kong and others who are fighting for freedom around the world has to be taken seriously right here. And I think your work, and I think the particular work of the Bar Association, are part of that, and it has to be constantly pushing to the edge of where rights have yet to exist, that people are continue to be marginalized and ignored, and where there always be political pressure to corrupt and invade and attack the rule of law.
This conversation, this global conversation we're talking about here, it's not stable in the sense that it is also affected by global events as the course of history proceeds. Recent events have been quite dramatic, namely the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which João mentioned initially, thankfully. How has this war and the positioning of the global powers affected the discussion on democracy and the rule of law? Russia and Ukraine, you have China and Taiwan and Hong Kong and Macau. How are these linkages affecting this discussion? Or are they putting the discussion a bit in the shade while we concentrate on what's happening in Ukraine? And more importantly, the Western world. How do you view the Western world?
I feel like that they're looking at me, so I'm going to start, and then we can go clockwise.
This is for you. You drink your water.
So a couple of points just before getting into new. I think that's a great question. I'm often frustrated, and many people are, like you described, I think the rule of law, the principle that is for example, in the EU and the UN. It gets very frustrating when a body like the UN can't seem to actually live its principle.
Yeah.
I was in Prague actually last year when the human rights head Michelle would refuse to publish the Xinjiang Uyghurs atrocity report that it was until the very last day, and we were actually half joking with some of the Uyghur activists I was with that China was writing its edits until the last minute before they were allowed to actually publish the report. But I also think that what Ukraine has brought, I think, is it's an opportunity. No one a year ago, 16 months ago, imagined the atrocity that is now unfolding daily. I was in Bundestag in Germany the day that the invasion happened, and you can tell that people were genuinely shocked that this is taking place. And I think that it creates an opportunity for us to re-examine, and I think in a lot of ways it has already, the function, the mechanism of the EU and how and what it's supposed to do in the moment of crisis when there are these very clear challenges that are confronted by. But I think that's not enough, right? Because part of the rule of law mechanism now is that there are war crimes investigations. There are, the Hague, the National Criminal Court has announced these charges against Putin and some of the officials. And we have these daily images of war crimes that Ukrainians and the rest of the world want prosecuted. I think this is a moment of truth for some of these international mechanisms and bodies to be able to say, can we actually do and deliver some form of justice? And I this morning, and I want to be very clear that I'm very new to, this is my first visit to Lisbon. I got a chance to visit the Museum for the Political Prisoners this morning here in Lisbon. And having worked with human rights movement around the world, with the apartheid in South Africa, and with the what has happened in China, and listening to the stories of the trials here, I think that that's part of the challenge we have. We're talking about the respect of the law and the court. What is also at stake is, do people still believe in justice if the mechanism that we're putting our trust in does not deliver what we expect? And it might be a long time from now. It might take years and years. But I think that this is one of those moments where Ukraine brings up, and for me it's very connected to what the atrocity and genocide of the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region in China. If we don't step up, then this trust and this respect and this institutions will not survive.
Anything to add?
I would like to add something, of course. About your question, I think you are right about what people think when there is a serious situation like Ukraine's war. And we can say, and we can state and quote what happened in Portugal during the pandemic. As you know, we heard people saying that between our health and constitution, we prefer our health. You remember that? Of course. So, Portuguese constitution during the pandemic, nobody cared about it. So, I prefer to be alive than I don't care about. So, when people are stressed out with something that they consider as superior to constitution, to rights, whatever, they don't care if they don't have the rights. They just want to stay alive. And that's something that happened in Portugal during the pandemic. Because even lawyers, I heard, stating that between my health and the constitution, I prefer my health. Even though that particular question was not at stake. But people don't matter about constitution. As we all knew, there were several cases that due to the pandemic were justified even though they were not needed. So I would say that if people have to choose between rights and life, they don't care about the rights as long as they stay alive. And that's something that when there are few people that being stressed out, they don't prefer life to rights. We have several cases, of course. We had it in the history, but I would say the majority is not like that. And unfortunately in Portugal during the pandemic we saw several situations that people even criticized who wanted to talk about constitution. In Portugal. So
We have 10 minutes left or so, and if you guys don't mind, I'll open questions to the public. I'd just like to ask you to, I think there's a microphone. Or
we have a
otherwise-
microphone? No.
No, just,
But
it's a small room, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Just identify yourself, and if you can, just
If
for
you
time,
want.
if you want.
You can- yes.
If you want. And if you want to direct the question at the specific member of the panel, then it'll be more efficient.
My name is Carlos da Costa. I'm a Portuguese-American attorney. I would first off like to thank the Portuguese Bar Association and Mr. Samuel for having time to explain these matters. As a Portuguese-American attorney, I tend to look at the aspect of undermining why European countries have undermined human rights and democracy to a very specific point in time, 2008, financial crisis. And I look at it as an economic problem. And most countries, the one that I know of, have decided to put civil rights, to put human rights and democracy aside and try to somehow play into the PRC's game, which is to purchase strategic companies in European countries, and one of them in Portugal, the EDP, which is an electrical company, which, by the way, most of the board members were former politicians. And I really wonder, to what point has the PRC somehow bought these strategic companies in order to implement their way of looking at what society should look like. So my question to you is, do you believe that this strategy, this economic strategy, is what's undermining, what's behind somehow European countries putting aside civil rights and, as you said, in Portugal, allowing for extradition agreements which make no sense? Thank you.
My answer is yes. And I know it's more, I mean, I think it obviously it's more complicated, nuanced than that, but I think one of the, there are real challenges. I think it's not, I've heard from during my time here this week that, that China stepped up during the time of great needs. Nobody else wanted to rescue the grid, and China actually is very good at doing that, it turns out. They're also very good at lending people money and building bridges and roads everywhere. So I think that for me, it is not about just villainizing or saying that everything that the PRC does is somehow evil and that there's some kind of master plan. It's like the villain in the superhero movie where they tell you exactly what they're doing. But I do think that the reality, what we have seen, is that it is never just the money. And it is never just the investment. It is never just the infrastructure. And as much as we want to believe in a benign nature behind those things, that what I would say is that when regimes like Russia and China tell you exactly and show you exactly who they are, I tend to like to listen and believe them. I think that, again, I mentioned this earlier already, that I'm not under the illusion that somehow like Portugal's or even any country is going to all of a sudden say that we're going to, completely kick out Chinese. I think that I'm not fantasizing about, and I'm not advocating for this sort of simplistic view of decoupling and completely breaking off, because it's not possible. We're in a much different connected world today. But I also think that it doesn't hurt, and it ought to be the basic minimum, that we question and scrutinize and also explore alternatives. Right? We continue, there are going to be other situations where nations are going to fall into financial distress. They're going to need rescuing, that it's going to need infrastructure. And that, what hopefully we have learned from our history, recent and ancient, is that it's too late when the tanks rolls in, and then we try to figure out how to reverse engineer ourselves out of these entanglement and dependency that we're in. And that's part of, and fundamentally, I think at the end of the day, what I would at least argue is that China made a deal with the world and with Hong Kong for 50 years. We didn't get to 25 before they said that this is a historic document that no longer has any effect. Yeah. And that ought to show you what comes with the deal and the money and the investment. And I think that it's behooves, I think, anyone who's entering into a deal, I think as you described, to be willing to question and to be willing to scrutinize.
Any more questions? I'll take the lead then. And looking forward, I mean, this question of the 50 years, maybe naively, we believe that this was in good faith, you know, one nation, two systems, but it didn't even reach halfway in one case, in the Macau case. This happened, and it took us to the situation which you described very somberly now in Hong Kong specifically. Now we have the opportunity to ask you here, somebody who's got many insights into the issue, without painting China as an evil monster in the superhero film. It has a strategy. What is its strategy, and how is it going to implement that strategy in the next few years? So what can we expect while we try and raise awareness of democracy and rule of law on this side? What can we expect to see in the next few years?
I just want to say that I'm not an international policy expert. I want to make sure that this is reflective of my experience. Sure. Is that I think that you see a aggressive approach from China to essentially try to export not only investment and money, but its way of thinking and governance that I think is permeating in a lot of different ways. I think people don't pay attention to, it's not just that they're investing in infrastructure, they are dominating discussions around internet governance and how do you government relates to development and global aid and all of these ways that I think China has come to, and the UN is a great example of this. You know, good luck trying to table a resolution in the UN that the Chinese doesn't like, because they can trot out 30, 40, 50 countries that they can just say, like, vote against it, send a letter about it. And I think that you're seeing this exporting, and this is what I think people underestimate, is that there are plenty of government, individual politicians, political parties around the world who looks at China and say that we want some of that because it works based on their interests. And I think that what I see and that's not for me an inevitability, because I think that Hong Kong, in other ways, Ukraine, are presenting these alternative opportunities and moments, whereas I'm really glad to be here in Portugal, because I believe that it's not just about villainizing the authoritarian regime, but it's about building relationship and friendship with freedom-loving people. No matter how small and how oppressed and how trapped they might be right now, that the way we stand with the people of Ukraine, the way that hopefully that Portuguese will stand with the people of Hong Kong and continue to stand up for others, these are the beginning, these are the muscles and the connective tissues that are necessary to counter what the PRC is doing. And there's no, and I'll say the end with this, people ask me why I still do this, because it seems so hopeless, right? People have a hard time imagining Hong Kong going back to where it was. And I always have to remind them that let's be clear here. Hong Kong was never a fully democratic, free society. We were a colony, and then we were turned back over under one country, two system, which in my mind is like half free, but not really.
And with a time frame.
Yeah, like it's like freedom, like 30% freedom, but with an expiration date. And I think that what gives me hope today is that that facade is gone. There's no free Hong Kong without a China that is free. And just as I think the PRC is exerting incredible amount of capital and resources to control and invest and partner with Russia to blockade airspace in Taiwan and to get into trade war with other, all of these things are about maintaining the centralized control. The oppressions of the Uyghurs and Tibet and the invasion of Taiwan potentially are all part of this maintenance of control that the regime needs to do. What gives me hope is that shows the vulnerability and weakness of a regime like China, where if people are willing to do what we're doing here, to talk freely, to build relationship, to act on behalf of those who don't have rights, and to aggressively protect and defend those rights, we can actually win. And I'm reminded when I saw the protests in China last year of in a country where there's no real world law, there's no freedom, there's no democratic political system. It turns out that freedom is not a Western, European, or American value. It happens that people in China understand when their rights are being violated. And that when their fellow citizens, even though they're Uyghur minorities, are being burned in an apartment building because the government says you can't get out because of COVID, they understand what it means to be free or not. And I think that part of the expansion of the free and democratic society is one of the reasons why I'm here, why I travel in Europe, is because we have to build these friendships that allows us to then turn around and say that what is happening, again, in Portugal, this is undemocratic, and we have to speak about it. That this is happening in China, this is happening in Ukraine, and that all of this is connected. And I think that there's been a lot of talks about backsliding of democracy around the world. And my friends at the Freedom House have this index that they publish every year. And what I want people to remember is that it is fragile, it is messy, but it is our job to defend and build new democratic institutions, to find and defend and define new rights, and to build new relationships that makes it possible for people who have never experienced freedom themselves publicly and politically to live in that new reality. And it applies not just in Russia and China and Iran, but it happens and applies right here in Portugal, in Lisbon.
Well, I think that's an excellent and positive note to end our session at the round table here. I'd like to thank Samuel, especially for his sharing his very interesting insights and his opinions. Please do come back to Portugal. We need more conversations like this, as you're saying. Thanks also to Lídia and João for your participation in this event. On a personal note, I'd like to thank the Ordem dos Advogados in Lisbon for its invitation, and ProPública as well. Thank you all for being here, those who are here and all those who are watching online. And good evening.